Hi, my name is Mary, and in today's video I'm going to be sharing with you the 21 books that I read in January of 2020. I wanted to get this year off to a really good start, so I've been reading pretty voraciously, so trying to get those numbers up, but also trying to read some of the challenges and TBRs that I've set for myself, both carrying over from last year and also this year, the ones that I've set for myself. So without further ado, let's get right into the books. On January 1st, I wanted to get the year off to a good start, so I read 6 books on that day. Obviously, they were quite short. They were 4 poetry collections and 2 plays, and I'm just going to talk about them pretty briefly because, as I've mentioned on this channel before, I find giving a sense of poetry collections to be some of the most difficult reviewing to do. The first collection that I want to talk about is called Unburial by Marc de Martino. This is a poetry collection that reads like a confessional, all of these interconnected poems surrounding the author's family history and growing up, actually kind of near where I grew up in Maryland. And I thought that most of the poems were pretty good, but it didn't quite strike me in the way that really good poetry strikes me, so I ended up giving it 3 stars. The next poetry collection I want to talk about is called A Distant Center by Harling. These are very short poems which are collected and translated from the Chinese. Harling, I think, just does not write the kind of poetry that I personally like. One of my pet peeves in poetry is poetry that feels like a lecture, just talking to in the second person about a you should or you must or here's what you should keep in mind. And it's just not personally what I like to read. There were 1 or 2 poems in here in the entire collection that I would say that I liked, and so I ended up giving this book 2 stars. I had slightly more success with this next one, I Shimmer Sometimes Too by Porsha Olayiwola. This is a poetry collection by a Black lesbian poet, and I really enjoyed it. There was a great rhythm here, a lot of the poems ended up sticking out to me. I gave this one 4 stars. The last poetry collection that I want to talk about is War of the Foxes by Richard Siken. I know Siken is like a favorite poet of the internet, especially of the gay internet, and so I feel kind of weird that most of the poems I didn't feel terribly much while I was reading. And I gave this one 3 stars. It was not something that I would seek out in the future for myself. I think he has good lines, but pulling them into poems, collecting them in that way, does not seem to be something that he does in a way that I personally prefer. Moving on to the plays, I read 2 plays on January 1st. The first of those was Pygmalion by Bernard Shaw. Pygmalion is about 2 gentlemen in the early 20th century in London who study the language patterns of people all over the world, but also including London, and they make a bet. One of them claims that he can turn a lower class girl into basically a duchess, just based on her voice, and it ensues a not terribly funny play, a kind of tragic and sad play about this woman being manipulated by these 2 men, and it very much came across like gender and class the play. It was very uncomfortable to read. It's not to say that I didn't enjoy it, and in fact I think I would like to see a production of this done, because I think that because it's a play about language, it would really benefit from being heard and not just read, but I don't mind that I read it, and I think I gave it 3 stars. The second play that I read was Steel Magnolias by Robert Harling. This covers a couple of months, maybe up to a year, it's now been a while since I read it, in the lives of women who attend a particular beauty salon, and the setting of the play is all within the beauty salon, and as they come in and out of that salon over time, you get a sense of what's happening in their broader lives. Unfortunately, what's happening in their broader lives is not a lot, and so I found the play mostly really boring, and I didn't get the heartwarming ending that some people seem to get from this, just based on certain plot developments, so I gave this play 2 stars. The next book that I read is one that certainly I did not finish in a day, and that was It by Stephen King, that absolute monster of a book. If you haven't heard of it before, it's the one with the creepy clown. Last year or the year before, I'm struggling to remember now, I read Elevation by Stephen King, and that was the first Stephen King book that I ever read, and I hated it. I gave it 1 star. I would give it 0 stars if I could. But I wanted to pick up It because I know that when it comes to Stephen King, there are books that are drastically ranging in quality, and there's ones that people love and ones that people hate, and I wanted to give him another shot, especially because I've been trying to read more horror lately. And so turns out I pretty much enjoyed it up to the 10% mark, up into the 10% left mark. So 90% of the way through the book, I really thoroughly enjoyed the book. I was full set to give it 5 stars. It was creepy and dark and disturbing. I like horror that isn't just scary, but is actually kind of grotesque and makes you uncomfortable as you read it as well. I think that's an underrated aspect of horror, and this book certainly does that. But then that last 10%, oh my god, it was probably one of the worst book endings that I've read in a long time, probably since The Female Persuasion by Meg Wolitzer. Like, books that have that last 10%. But I ended up giving it 4 stars because I wasn't going to let it stop me, no pun intended, from enjoying it, even if that's Stephen King trying to ruin his own book in the last section. What it also did was encourage me, because when I added it to my currently reading, I realized that I had added it to my TBR in 2012, which was when I joined Goodreads. It was one of the first books that I added to that TBR, which made me wonder what other books have been on my TBR since 2012 that I would still really enjoy if I actually got around to reading them. And so I made a 10 books that have been on my TBR the longest video, which I will link in the description box down below. The next book that I'm going to talk about is from that list, and that was The Woman in White by Wilkie Collins. The Woman in White follows a cast of characters surrounding a drawing master who has gone to a house of a lord to teach drawing and then conserve paintings. He's teaching drawing to the young ladies of the house. But when he's on his way, he meets a mysterious woman in white, and there are ramifications from this meeting and from a betrothal that one of these young ladies has to a seemingly upright gentleman. Now, the book is often pitched, at least it was pitched to me in my memory, as a ghost story or a gothic novel, a super gothic book. It was one of the books that was recommended to me after I read Jane Eyre. And I would say that it does have some of the gothic elements, but it really does take them and spins them off in a whole other direction. What it does is turn some of the gothic tropes into a sensation novel and more of a legal thriller, and I don't know if that sounds interesting to you, but it was super interesting to me. Once I hit about the 20% mark, it was one of those books that I just did not want to put down. It took me so long to get through those first 20% just because it wasn't what I was expecting, but once it hit that new pace, it was so enjoyable. It's one of my favorite classics that I've read in a long time, and I gave it 5 stars. The next classic that I read this month was The Phantom of the Opera by Gaston Leroux. It turns out that I also really enjoyed this one, but take this with the grain of salt that I've never seen either the stage production or the movie of The Phantom of the Opera. I only knew about it from pop culture, so you know there is a haunting at the Paris Opera House, and a mysterious ghost takes up with one of the opera singers and turns her kind of into a diva. However, I didn't know what to expect. This book is, if you like Gothic 19th century literature, this book is jam-packed with all of the tropes. It has all of them, and if that sounds as appealing to you as it does to me, we should be friends, because I love a good Gothic novel that's just dripping with all the good stuff. It was really enjoyable. I wouldn't say that I found the central protagonist especially enjoyable, but just the experience and the setting and the way that the plot developed. It was unexpectedly funny at parts, very dark at other parts, and it turned into something that I enjoyed, and I gave it 4 stars. Moving from something that I really enjoyed to something that I didn't enjoy at all, this month I also picked up a short story collection, The Assassination of Margaret Thatcher by Hilary Mantel. I am eagerly anticipating Hilary Mantel, the sequel to Hilary Mantel's Wolf Hall. The 3rd book in the trilogy is coming out this March. I read Wolf Hall and then Bring Up the Bodies in the last couple of years, and loved them. They are my favorite historical fiction books, and so I'm very much excited for it. And so while I've been waiting for that, I thought I would pick up a collection of Hilary Mantel's short stories. These are mostly either contemporary or recent historical fiction, so going back probably at the earliest to the 1980s, and they follow broad range of characters, as short stories do. The first, I think, 3 short stories, I gave 1 out of 5 stars. You can see on my Goodreads, I updated my activity with a rating for each of the stories. I didn't like this collection. It made me really mad. I was just stunned that there were such low quality short stories here, and it doesn't have any of Hilary Mantel's magic in it at all. Characters who were flat and boring, plots that didn't make sense, things that made me super uncomfortable, like ableism and other things. It was just a very uncomfortable and unfortunate read, and I gave this one, I think, 1 star, and I would stick to that. It's not something that I would recommend. Next, let's move on to things that I've been reading for school. I know that sounds terribly exciting, but I've been enjoying some of them anyway. The first of those is called Utrecht, Caravaggio, and Europe, edited by Bernd, Ebert, and Liesbeth M. Helmus. This is a catalog for a Caravaggisti, that is, followers of the painter Caravaggio, who came from Utrecht, and it's a catalog that accompanied an exhibition of their work. I give this one 3 stars. There were some of the essays that I really enjoyed, others that I didn't enjoy. That is usually the case with catalogs. I don't know how much interest this would be to somebody who wasn't studying the Caravaggisti, but it is what it is. If it sounds interesting to you, definitely have a look at it in your local library at least. Next is another catalog for that same area that is Northern Nocturnes, Nightscapes in the Age of Rembrandt by Adriaan E. Waiboer, I believe, and this is all about nighttime paintings in Rembrandt's times. That's the Dutch Golden Age. And I enjoyed this one as well. I think I gave this one 3 stars. It wasn't perfect, but it was something that is helpful in my research. This is the thing about writing things for school, is that enjoyability and helpful to my research are not necessarily the same thing, and so my rating tends to balance that out. It didn't provide exactly what I was looking for, but it was something that I enjoyed flipping through and found moderately helpful. For a different project, I read Chivalry and Medieval Europe, which is a collection of essays edited by Katie Stevenson and Barbara Gribling. This I gave 4 stars. It has essays all about the way that people in the past, but after the Middle Ages, thought about the Middle Ages, and especially how they thought about chivalry. So chivalry in the Renaissance, chivalry in the later early modern period, in the 18th century, in the 19th century, up to now. And while it was mostly a mixed bag, there were more essays that I liked than I didn't, and the ones that I really liked, and so this one I feel pretty comfortable giving a 4 star. Another book that I read, which unfortunately has one really awful title, is The Badass Librarians of Timbuktu by Joshua Hammer. The book actually has a very interesting premise. What it does is discuss the way that a group of people have been trying to preserve medieval and early modern manuscripts in sub-Saharan Africa, a place that's not traditionally thought to have been a great medieval intellectual center, but of course it was, during the 1980s to the early 2000s, when there was so much political turmoil in that area, and many different parties were interested in stamping those manuscripts out. So the premise is so interesting. I gave this book 3 stars. The reason that I didn't find it to be amazing or even to be really good is that the proportions of what it talked about were not there for me. I understand you need to have a little bit of political background to support what you're talking about when you say that certain groups want these manuscripts destroyed, and there's a lot of turmoil in that area, so you need to give a sense of that, but it was way too much. I was really interested in the sections about the manuscripts, about their preservation, but not so much interested in the political, just because I've heard those stories told in other books significantly better, and so those sections really dragged, and there's way, way, way too much of them. So I gave this book 3 stars in the end. It's not that I wouldn't recommend it, but it was not as good as I think it could have been. The next couple of books that I'm going to talk about are from different TBRs that I've had on my channel lately. The first of those from my art fiction TBR, and that is The Collector's Apprentice by B.A. Shapiro. B.A. Shapiro is a huge name in art fiction kind of circles. People who really enjoy art fiction tend to recommend Shapiro's works because she writes a lot about old masters in the art market, but in that kind of fiction way, This one is about a young woman who, at the start of the novel, has lost her family's art collection because she was taken in by a con man who was going to marry her, or she thought he was going to marry her, and so she had her family invest in his business adventures, and he took the money and ran, basically. So it starts with that, and she has to redeem herself. There's a really convoluted timeline. There's multiple timelines that you have to follow, and people adopt different names and different timelines, which made the reading experience not difficult, but more tedious than I thought it needed to be. There's also a huge romance portion of this book that I had no interest in, and so I was just flipping through it at that point. I ended up giving this book 3 stars. It was not my favorite, and I'm hoping that some of the other art fiction that I pick up in the near future is much, much more enjoyable. Another book that was on my TBR from last year, in my art history TBR, that I really needed to get read is this one. This is an exhibition catalog called Monsters and Myths, Surrealism and War in the 1930s and 1940s. This was an exhibition at the Baltimore Museum of Art, and it was a really great exhibition. It was all about surrealists and the way that surrealists cope with war and the way that their art reflects their own experiences as soldiers, but also their experiences as intellectuals who were persecuted, especially in the Spanish Civil War and then the World War II. This is it was a great exhibition. The catalog, again, I have to balance. I think that this is intellectually a great catalog, and there's essays in here that are really enjoyable, but just based on personal enjoyment, I gave this one, I think, a 3-star, just because out of all of the essays in here, there were only a handful that I personally really enjoyed, and there were topics that they didn't talk about, which I thought I would have enjoyed hearing them talk about more. Still, if you get a chance to breeze through this catalog, there's a lot of really great art in here, especially if you're interested in modernism in the early 20th century. Recently on my channel, I put up my Informed Citizen TBR. That's all the books that I'm planning on reading for the election year of 2020, and the first book that I read for that is Fire and Fury Inside the Trump White House by Michael Wolff. This is a disturbing book to read if you're anything like me, politically anyway, and I thought that it was really enjoyable. I gave it a 4-star because I could not put it down, and I liked the way that the story was told, even if I find the subject matter distasteful at best. So if you're looking for a book on the Trump White House, I'm sure you have many recommendations, but this one definitely gets a thumbs up from me. Lastly, I will just briefly mention the books that I have covered in other videos on this channel already in this month. The first of those is Who Says You're Dead? Medical and Ethical Dilemmas for the Curious and Concerned by Jacob M. Apfel. This is a book of ethical dilemmas, and I talked about it in its own nonfiction micro-review that I will leave in the comments down below. These last 3 books were all books that I read for my challenge of reading a book from every country. They are The Atom Station by Haldor Laxness, Death and the Penguin by Andrei Kirchhoff, and 7 Brothers by Alexis Kivy. These are books that I reviewed in their own wrap-up video, so I will leave that in the comments down below. Okay, so those are the 21 books that I read in January of 2020. Let me know if you have read any of these books in the comments down below, or what you are planning to read in the upcoming month. Thank you very much for watching. Bye!